At 15 years old, I snuck into the nightclub, and which was easy to do in those days. They never carded you, so I went in and I saw Machu Picchu, and I said, "This is it." I was just blown away by the music. I got into it, and about 10 or 15 years late, well, between 10 and 15 years later, I was actually playing in bands with all the guys that I had heard that first night that I went there. So.
Cuando dices amorcito, coqueteando, yo me incendio como leña. En verano soy tu amigo.
So Latin music was always a hobby. When I say hobby, I did it professionally, meaning I made money. I couldn't play at the level I wanted to as a hobbyist unless I did it professionally, because I couldn't get, you're talking about a format that at the time, like in the 80s, was about getting 10 or 15, anywhere between 10 and 15 people into a room to practice, to produce something, and the level of musicians you needed each position was absolute top. So the only way you could get people of that caliber was if you paid them. So it had to be a professional endeavor. But I never dreamed of doing it full time to like earn a living, because I knew I'd be broke in a second. I know I've talked to other guys in town. You couldn't find a single person in town who would want to do this professionally, just because they know what the consequences would be on their life and their lifestyle. And you end up hating the music, because the music is not a form of expression. It's a form of kind of trying to make a living, but barely. What DC has, and has had since about, I want to say 79, 80 maybe, is critical mass in terms of the Latin population. So there were enough Latinos in town to create a scene that was sustained itself, where they had their own. So from I guess from an ethnomusicology standpoint, they had their own local artists, their own people that they liked to hear. There was enough of a scene, enough opportunities to go out, and you had a culture within a culture. So you had the ability for a Latin scene to exist that wasn't influenced by the American scene, and I think that's changed a lot recently. But back in the day, it was really isolated. You had all these different cultures come, and they weren't just isolated themselves. You would go to Latin clubs, and these were people that wanted to be in a Spanish-speaking area or a Spanish-speaking situation. They wanted environment. They wanted to, but they didn't want to just hear their own. So yeah, this is the key thing that DC has, has a high level of educated people from Latin America that come. So you had a mix of people who migrated for whatever reason. And then a lot of people came here to study. Created a number of places that had a Latin ambiance, but it wasn't defined by one country or another country. Like if you went to New York, you would see if you go to Queens, it's that one area in Jackson Heights is all Colombian, 100% Colombians. They're not really. It's their Colombian bands, Colombian restaurants. You have Dominicans, you have Puerto Ricans. It always struck me as being a little more or a little more separated in terms of countries than you would find here. So I think that made DC a really good place for Latin music. We have the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines all have major military bases here, and all those bases have orchestras and bands. They have concert bands, they have marching bands, they have actual orchestras, they have jazz bands. So most of the Latin bands here in town had great horn players, because we had this incredible pool of American horn players from all these military bands. So if you needed like a really good trumpet player, a guy who could just play high D all night long, you get a guy from the Navy Commodores. That's part of why the quality of a lot of the DC Latin music was better than you would find in other cities, because we had real serious horn talent where other cities wouldn't have it. And that created an interesting mix, because you have So usually the percussionists were all Latin. The horn players the horn section would have a lot of Americans, and they all got to know each other. Um, like a lot of the horn players wouldn't be really into. They liked the music, but they weren't into be kind of getting into the whole Latin scene. So it was interesting how all this mix of different people. There was always pressure on the bands when I was playing up through the late '90s to be playing the latest thing that you heard on Latin radio. So it was like you had to do covers by the big salsa bands, the big merengue bands that were at that moment. So the whole repertoire was Frankie Ruiz through the early '90s, and then Tito Rojas came on, and you had to go out and get all his material. And I'm just throwing out names, but it was driven by the radio, and then kind of what was big in New York or what was big in Puerto Rico at that time. And now it's all about classics. It's like all the interest is in music, a lot of which is like from the mid '70s and early '80s. The problem with the small bands is that it's the musicians have to, just to make it entertaining, they have to kind of do what jazz bands did in the '50s, which is get very improvisational and very kind of unstructured, which is a positive on one end, but the whole beauty of salsa and merengue was the size of the orchestras and on all these layers of things that were orchestrated, that were going on, and you didn't just have multiple horns, you had multiple sections of horns, and you had multiple, you didn't have two percussionists, you had 4 or 5, and you didn't just have two guys singing coro who were also trying to play other instruments, but you had actual people who were choristas. Maybe if at the peak of kind of the big bands, you'd have 3 guys doing coro, and 2 of them would be playing maracas and guiro, and that doesn't exist anymore. But that element gave a fullness. And what's so kind of interesting is that what people want to hear in the clubs is this music from the '70s and '80s, but the bands that they put up to play don't have enough people to play it the way it was done in the '70s and '80s. So it's always it's always like a small group interpretation of the way it was done. I've always wondered why there wouldn't be more demand for bigger groups if people are interested in the classic music in order to hear it exactly the way it was played. Well, it's a mystery. So. As someone who plays for people, you obviously wouldn't do it if you didn't want other people to enjoy it and have fun. But I think what's really great about a genre like salsa or like Latin music, so you have to merengue, cumbia, and all that stuff, is that when it's there's a bigger picture, which is just it's some sort of system, and when this is a music that sounds horrible if it's not done right. It hurts when it's not done right, and so when everything just fits together, and it's not that hard to when you have good musicians. When I say good, I don't mean trained. I mean people who understand how it works. They could even be very simple musicians who just know how to do a few things, but the one thing they know how to do, they do well. The role, maybe it's just a guy who have no training in music, can't sing, but he can play guiro, and he has the feel. And when you get 5 or 10 guys all locked in like that, and that's an amazing feeling, and that's where the fulfillment comes from. It's the product.
El único que toma con las cerraduras puestas y hace sufrir a las teclas. Un saludo para la loca.
What it's all about is the music, because the music is when especially something like salsa that has this additive effect where you just get 5-10 guys into a groove, and it's so powerful. It's so powerful, and you bring the crowd in. It's just great. There's nothing more fulfilling than a really good night where the audience got into it. Or let's put it like this: a really good night is when the audience would have to be deaf not to get into it. I mean, just everything's on.